In this video, we're going to look at how to use workstation triggers and how to set up tasks on a moving conveyor line. So first, let's set up our conveyor. So you can go to a conveyor by pressing Ctrl P on your keyboard. That opens this Open Asset menu and typing conveyor. And we have this generic conveyor, which you can drag and drop into the world. An alternate way is to go to the folder that contains this asset through your content browser. Now ensure that under View Options, Show Plugin Content or Show Engine Content is enabled, depending on if you have installed the plugin as a project plugin or an engine plugin. Since I've installed the plugin as a project plugin, I have Show Plugin Content enabled. That should show Motion Flow Content here. And if you go under Motion Composer, Blueprints, and Simulation, and then this is where we have all our simulation constructs or assets. And then you can select the conveyor and drag it. I'm not going to do that since I've already done that here. So we're going to make this conveyor spawn and move car chassis that we're going to work, and we're going to have a worker work on these car chassis while they are moving. So if I want to move it towards the end, what I'm doing is like I double clicked on this spline point and I'm moving it towards the end. That sets the length of this conveyor. So the next thing we're going to do is select the item of the class that we want to create, and under the details panel under item creation, under item class to create, I'm going to select the chassis. So if you were to hit play, you will notice that the chassis moves down the conveyor, and another one will get spawned when a certain amount of time elapses. So the time is set by the cycle time, which we specify under the settings in the conveyor. So every 5 seconds it will spawn a new car. So let's say we want it to be 15 seconds. And secondarily, we want our car chassis to be, and this is not really a chassis, but we want our car to point towards the conveyor. So if I want to do that under item creation, the item relative transform, that's the transform of the item that we are creating or spawning. So we want to rotate it about Z by minus 90 degrees, and that will make this car move in the direction of the conveyor. And then every 50 seconds, we will get the next car to spawn that we can then work on as needed. So next we're going to set up a workstation for our worker to perform a work. And what we're going to do is we're going to install one of these seats. Now this example card that I'm using has already pre-set up as an assembly, and then the assembled items are the car seats here. So we have a tutorial on how to create and use assemblies. Please watch that if you're unfamiliar with the concept, but I'm just going to assume that knowledge is present, so I'm going to move forward. So now we're going to create a workstation for our worker to install a car seat. So first we need a place for the worker to pick up a car seat. So you can use any geometry into the world or any actor that's placed into the world. For the purposes of this tutorial, I am dragging an empty actor from the Place Actors tab here into the world, which I'm going to use as a workstation. And then if I click on Add Components under Details, I can select a task or MC task. And then I'm going to, under the task performance, I'm going to choose Perform Pickup. And item type would be chair. And then I'm going to make it spawn continuously at an interval. So every, let's say, 10 seconds, or every 15 seconds, so that's what we set the cycle time of our assembly line. Every 15 seconds, we want a new chair to spawn here. So, but thinking more about it, let's just set it to 5 seconds so that we see that happen frequently. Because what can happen when the worker is done with his loop of tasks, and if the chair is not there to pick up, then the worker will stop performing further tasks. So we want the chair to be present whenever the worker has finished performing their loop of tasks. So now this chair task has been created. We're going to place it appropriately. I want to move it above the ground a bit. And then this is the arrow where the worker approaches it from. I double click it and rotate it so that it's facing the direction I want our worker to come from. which is from the viewer left. And then this is where I want the worker to stop and then pick up the chair. So you can do that. You can specify that by placing the arrow at that location. So I'm going to press escape to come out of the editing mode for this arrow, or the component editing mode. Next, I'm going to set up install or put down workstation. So we're picking up here, but we are going to be installing it inside the car. Now this car is moving, so like we want to install over here when the car is somewhere around here. Right now there is no car there. So in order to do that, we're going to use a dynamic workstation. There's also a tutorial on dynamic workstation. If you're unfamiliar with the concept, I recommend watching that tutorial as well if you feel you need more information on how to use those, but I'll go quickly over its usage here as well. So if you go back to I was pressing Control P to bring up my dynamic workstation, but in the content browser we also have it already navigated to the correct folder, so I'm going to use that instead. And then I'm going to drag the dynamic workstation into the world here. And dynamic workstation is where we will perform or specify what work we want to perform. This is not where the work is going to be performed. We're going to create a trigger as well. So we're going to drag this workstation trigger. And this, when triggered by this car, is when the dynamic workstation will get attached to the car that will be here during simulation, and then that's what we are going to perform the work on. So the dynamic workstation over here allows you to specify what task to do, where to do with respect to like the item that you want to work on, and then the workstation trigger uses the actual object in the world, and when it hits that trigger, then the actual dynamic workstation gets attached to it. All that is taken care of. You don't need to program that behavior. We have already preset that up. And then once the dynamic workstation gets attached, then your worker will go and perform the task that you have specified on the dynamic workstation. So what target works? So for setting the settings for this workstation trigger, the target workstation is the dynamic workstation, and the item class is the car chassis class, which is here. So now one thing we need to ensure that our whatever item class that we want to use has a collision volume, and this looks like this one doesn't. And now you can see that this is an assembly since I've opened this. So there are brake lights, and there are 4 chairs, which are all assemblies that we have set up with the relevant assembly class. And you can create assemblies that you can then assemble using your simulation. So I'm just going to create a box collision here. I don't want it parented under here. I want it parented under the root. You can make it the root if you would like, but this should work for this purpose. So I'm going to move it into the center roughly and scale it so that it encompasses the car. I'm going to scale it forward a bit. So now this should allow this car to be triggered by this workstation trigger. So that's something to remember. Every item that needs to be spawned on a conveyor and it needs a workstation trigger, then you need to have a collision volume for that object or for that item. So now that we have set that up, let's set up our dynamic workstation. Again, the item class is going to be the chassis class. And now we can specify what do we want to do here. So we want to, since this is the car coming from here, we want to install the front left seat. So this is the seat we want to install. And again, like just to really clarify, like where this dynamic workstation is in your world doesn't matter, because it will get attached correctly to this car when it moves, or the car that gets spawned and moves and gets triggered by this workstation trigger. So this we are just using to specify what tasks that are present on that dynamically spawned car on the conveyor. So I'm going to choose MC task as a component that I'm adding to the dynamic workstation. Going to do perform put down. Item type is chair. And then we are using an assembly, right? This car is an assembly. I want to install it at the front left location. I'm first going to specify what assembly class we are using, which is, again, in this case, a chassis class. And then if you select the assembly dropdown and click on the assembly dropdown, it will show you all the available assemblies. Front left, front right. And we want the front left chair to be assembled. So that's what we're going to select. So in this particular case, the orientation of your task doesn't matter. Like you can see that your chair, if I select this task and move it around, the chair orientation doesn't matter because it will get assembled here. However, the arrow orientation does matter. In the future, we will make this potentially hidden if you're using an assembly. But if you want, you can align it. It doesn't quite matter. But what matters is that you want to align the arrow for the character that you want, or for the direction you want the character to approach it from. So I'm going to rotate it, and this is how I want him to approach, from this direction. And I want it to stop about here, about this distance from the car, to install the car seat over here. So that's basically our description. I'm going to rename this as put down chair. And I'll rename this actor. So this is where we're going to pick up our chair from. Let's call it chair workstation. And I'll rename this task as pickup chair. So now we are ready to start using these. All we need now is our AI character. So you can press Control P and type MC AI character and drag and drop that, or you can go to Motion Composer Blueprints, Motion Composer Characters, Mannequin Blueprints, and you can select the MC AI character from there. So now we're ready to create our simulation. We have done all the environmental setup that is needed. So I'll go to in my demo folder here, and you can use any folder that you'd like. And then we're going to create, let's start by working in a new folder here. So I'll call this moving car. And if you right click here under Motion Composer, you'll see the option Scenario Blueprint. And here we are going to call it Moving Car Scenario Blueprint. So if I double click or press enter, that opens up the editor. Now we're going to set up our simulation here. So first we want our character to perform a task of pickup from the chair workstation. So which worker do we want to work on? Which is, we just called it MC AI character. You can rename it if you would like. And then the workstation that we want to work on, we call it chair workstation. And then the task pickup chair got automatically selected because that was the only task on that workstation. I'm going to duplicate this by pressing Control W. And then we're going to change the workstation to dynamic workstation, which is this workstation. And then put down chair, which was the only available option, got automatically selected for us. But remember that this put down we are doing on an assembly. So we need to specify what assembly to work on. Otherwise, this is not going to work. So if I don't specify that, and I try to just run the simulation like so, I pick up chair and put down chair, or press compile, then we'll get an error here. First, I need to specify, before that, I need to specify what level we are working on. So in order to do that, we're going to select on the initial values of your class button over here, and here we'll specify the empty demo map level. So now if I press compile, then you should get that error that I was talking about, is that put down chair failed because the assembly container is required, which we haven't provided. So we are going to do that now. So we're going to enable that, and we need to provide what is the instance of the object in the world that will provide us, that you want to assemble on, and which we know is the car that was triggered here, because that's where we want to put down the chair. When this car gets spawned, it moves, it triggers by this trigger volume, and when that gets triggered, that's the car that we want to perform the put down chair on. That's what we need to provide over here. So in order to do that, we need to get an handle or an instance of that card that just triggered this trigger volume. So to do that, right click here, Motion Composer, Workstation Trigger, because that's the Workstation trigger that we created. We have an event in the scenario graph for this Workstation trigger. And we need to specify which trigger we want to use. We only have one, so only one was presented here in this drop-down list. So now whenever this gets triggered, it will give us an instance of who triggered it. And that's what we will perform our put-down chair on. So this is all the setup that should be needed for us to set up the moving target. Now, like in our previous tutorial, what we did was we stopped the conveyor from moving at the beginning. So we disable start at begin play and we enable manual move. In this case, we will let the conveyor keep moving by itself because we don't want it to pause at pause locations, for example, and we move it manually in the scenario blueprint. So let's see if I compile, and we are still getting an error, and that we are getting that because we haven't created a execution dependency between these two. So that's needed because if you're getting data from here, you can only get data from here when this has been executed. So only then when this has been executed, you want to execute this. So I'm going to connect the execution between these two items here. If I press compile, now I should not get any error. And I can close this. And the other thing I need to do is drag and place this into the world, so because this is what is going to run the simulation. So if you were to hit play now, let's see what that looks like. If you have set up things correctly, the character should pick up the chair. It rotates because the orientation of the chair is different for the carrying versus where you're picking it up from. And when the trigger gets hit, the character should walk towards and install it on the car. And looks like that's not happening, so we have probably set up something incorrectly. So let's press escape and let's validate that our trigger firstly is placed in a location where it is going to be actually be hit. It is possible that it is too small and the car is just floating above it. So I'm going to make the radius slightly bigger, or you could move it up here as well to ensure that it's actually getting hidden. The other thing to validate is that your item class is correctly set here and your dynamic workstation is correctly set up here, which it looks like it is. So there could be something else going on wrong as well, but let's see that if that were to resolve our issue. The other thing that happens sometimes when this doesn't work is when your collision volumes are not set correctly on your items. So this time, as we saw, that it worked. So it went and installed the chair. It picks up the chair because it is set to repeat, and then he's going to wait until the trigger gets triggered again. And we can look at that. We can validate that by opening this blueprint. And from here, we want to select the moving car scenario VP, which we have placed into the world. I'm just going to make it a bit smaller so we can see both things at the same time. So you'll see that put down when the workstation trigger gets hit, which it was now, put down chair will get executed. Pickup chair gets executed as soon as the pickup chair is finished. And then that says that I'm ready to go. So this bubbles start flowing here, but this will only execute when all the incoming execution pins have been executed. Now the workstation trigger got executed as well. So then the character will go ahead and perform the put down chair. So this is how, we have talked about this in other tutorials, but this is how you can set up some complex interdependencies by merely connecting execution pins or dependency pins, as we showed in some other tutorials. Now, other thing to note that we sort of auto slide the character or move the character along with this card because it is moving. So that simulates a moving assembly line. So you can have a character sort of perform these kind of tasks where the character seems like it's getting on and off from a moving assembly line. We are going to improve this behavior further in the future by actual support for moving assembly lines, but this should allow you to get that simulation going in the meanwhile. So that's all I wanted to talk about in this tutorial. Thank you.